Okay. All right, so our job for today, oh, there's Jade. Okay, cool. So our job for today is to define what culture is. And then, like I said on Wednesday, what we'll do is we'll look at some cultural differences and have some class discussion centered around that. So for today, it's going to be kind of an introduction, defining what culture is, different types of cultures within a culture, and then we'll go from there on Wednesday. All right. So when we look at culture, and what we're really looking at is two types of processes. Okay, people adhere to various rules and standards that are created and maintained in overall culture or the culture of an activity or a group. So as this picture displays two individuals in a karate match, a martial arts match. And martial artists are known to be extreme and visible respect for each other. So within competition within our broader society, we often don't view the other side with compassion and with respect, but it's part of the culture of martial arts to show each other respect and concern. So a significant difference is that you'll never hear in professional fights, which often contain significant amount of virtual and trash talking ahead of the time, many opponents demonstrate respect and concern for each other afterwards. Okay. So what is culture based on this? Culture refers to shared beliefs, values, and practices that people have together. And this is different from what we consider society. Society refers to people who live in a definable community and who also share a culture. So for example, in the world, we have Western culture versus Eastern culture. And it's split among the European countries, the United States and the Americas, and then that's considered Western culture, whereas Eastern culture starts with the Asiatic countries. So there's the overall culture, Western versus Eastern. Probably the biggest difference between these overall cultures is the Western culture focuses on individuals, whereas in the Eastern culture, the focus is not on individuals, the focus is on family and community. So in Western culture, I felt it's because of me. I succeed, it's because of me. In Eastern culture, I succeed, my family succeeds. My family succeeds, I succeed. And there's no difference between those two. Vice versa, if I fell, my family falls. Okay. So, but within Western culture, we have different societies, and we'll focus on Western culture for right now. So for example, in Europe, we have German society, English society, Denmark society, based on the countries and the languages that they speak. So even though there is this Western overtone of individualism, within those there are different types of societies that live in a definable community, but also share the culture. Here in the United States, we can talk about the broader Western culture, but we also know that there's strong Native American communities or societies within this broader culture, okay? And the other thing that I should say is there can be subcultures within a culture as well. And I'll define that here in just a little bit. So here's another way to kind of think about or define culture, as we can think about the material culture, which refers to the objects or the belongings of a group of people. So if you think about, what's important here in the United States to people, you can probably think of things like cell phones, clothing, vehicles we drive, those types of things are things that are part of our American material culture. Fast food is probably another good example. It's something that is part of this culture and is partly driven by the culture. The non-material culture refers to the ideas, attitudes, and beliefs of a society, okay? So this can be things like religious views. This could be things like our views of law and the legal system and government and Democrat versus Republican, and what those beliefs and attitudes are within our society. And then there's cultural universals. And these refers to patterns or traits that are globally common to all societies. And probably the best example of this is there's not a culture in the world that doesn't have a concept of mother or mom. Now, the definitions for fathers can vary across different cultures, but very commonly, mother is defined similarly among all our shared cultures in the world. So that's something we would call a cultural universal. So the question that we can ask is what types of things are probably common across different cultures, and what would be most similar, right? So we can look at things like music, the visual arts, humor, movies, and other things across cultures and say there's concepts of music in all cultures. And there's concepts of visual art in all cultures, paintings, drawings, those types of things. These are two things that we would find very universal. However, their expression may be different, okay? For example, the culture here in the United States often use visual arts as a means of self-expression, whereas in other cultures, visual arts are used to tell stories or to provide information, and that's just an example. Where cultures will start to slightly differ is in the issues of humor and movies. Now, most all cultures, except for some indigenous cultures in the Pacific and the Amazon and stuff, all have concepts of movies. And in all societies, there's this type of humor. But these are two areas where things probably greatly differ based on the culture you're in. For example, in the German and Russian culture, they have a very dry humor. It's not, it's almost like they're not even telling a joke, but they will laugh to it as much as we do here in the West to some of the really out there stuff that we hear in the United States. So, but these are all things that we can say, you know, a lot of these things are universal. Probably the least universal would be movies, because there's still societies where that technology doesn't exist yet, or the access to it is very limited. But definitely these three, there's universals, but then there's different minute ways of expression based on the culture that we're in. And these are just some terms that I want to make sure that we have, so when we move into Wednesday and have a conversation about these different things, we'll have an understanding of them. So ethnocentrism is the practice of evaluating another culture according to the standards of one's own culture. Okay, so this is kind of like when, you know, a citizen here in the United States criticizes the practices in China based on our culture. Okay, so the whole, you know, arranged marriage is a good example that still really happens in rural China and even in parts of the urban areas. And it's definitely something that occurs quite frequently in the Middle East. And often when this subject is talked about, it's done through the American lens, the United States citizen's lens, that says arranged marriage takes away free choice, takes away free agency, and has nothing to do with love, and love is important, and so that practice is wrong. Okay, that's taken an ethnocentric view of a cultural pattern we see somewhere else. Okay, cultural imperialism is a deliberate imposition of one's own culture values on another culture. And here in the United States, we probably have the best example of that, about how the United States put many Native American children into boarding schools to culturate them, to make them wear what a proper quote unquote United States citizen should wear, and talk quote unquote in a Western tone. And so that one's, I think, especially in classes like ours and a college like ours, is probably one of the most, best examples of cultural imperialism. Cultural shock is an experience of personal disorientation when confronted with unfamiliar ways of life. Okay, and I don't know about many of you. I wasn't born and raised in a place like Tucson. I was born and raised in a little town far away from big city life, those types of things. And the first thing that I did when I went to a larger place is I became really, really good friends with a gay man. And I didn't know he was gay until he told me, he introduced me to his partner. And that was a cultural shock to me, because in that small community I was raised in, gay and lesbian was talked about, but it was always talked about, it doesn't happen here. It's something that happens to people who are completely disoriented from the world. A lot of the negative stereotypes we used to associate with that sexual orientations. And it shocked me, and I know this sounds ridiculous. The shock was, my parents always said if I interact with a gay person, I'm at risk of being gay, and that's never happened. Okay, so I bring up this story because those cultural shock can often change a person and change their views of different people, and so on one end it can be good to purposely go, if you need to, or have that cultural experience from a different place or a different area. Cultural shock can also have a negative effect on individuals as well, and we see this a lot with immigrants coming to the United States and having a difficult time adapting to the United States culture. Okay. Cultural relativism is the practice of assessing a culture by its own standards. So this is the opposite of ethnocentrism. In this case, what an individual does, and I'll bring up arranged marriage, is they go in and they try to understand arranged marriage from that Eastern cultural perspective, not the Western culture perspective, to see what drives it. Remember, everything that we talk about in sociology has a functional structural purpose that kind of helps that particular society progress and be successful. Okay. And then the last one term is xenocentrism, is the belief that another culture is superior to one's own. So xenocentrism is the belief that those people living in Denmark are much more superior than people living here in this country. I think a lot of xenocentrism occurs especially south of the border and in southern South America, where you have people trying to come to the United States because they have this belief that their life will be better, that everything is wonderful in the United States and everything will work out perfectly. That's a form of xenocentrism, viewing their own culture in a negative light, that as it compares itself to another culture. Okay. We're going to come back to a lot of these questions that I'm skipping. I think we'll come back to this Wednesday, and that'll be part of our conversations. Okay. So just continuing on with some more terminology. So we went over different cultural orientations. These are now going to become the components of what a culture is. So we have values. These are cultural standards for discerning what is good and just in a society. And then we have beliefs. We have tenets or convictions that people hold to be true. Okay. Now notice this doesn't say that it's a fact. All right. It's a belief. So truth is in the eye of the beholder. Ideal culture refers to the standards society would like to embrace and live up to, whereas a real culture is a way society really is based on what actually occurs and exists. So a perfect example of this is here in the United States. On the ideal level, we stress the importance of children. We stress the importance of growth and development. We stress the importance of bringing up good citizens and that we should care for our children. And we should do what we need to do to make sure that they can have the best life they can have. However, our real culture says something totally different. Our real culture says we don't fund anything that will be at a benefit of a child that's going to take away from my adult ability. So, we have what's called the child care crisis in the United States right now, where parents wanting to go to work will be working for $5-6 an hour because they're paying so much in child care. We haven't placed a value on child care and early childhood providers. Many places still hire people directly off the street to take care of our littlest, most vulnerable children in society. We know the issues of funding public school and actually putting good resources into public school. And then we can look at other ends, the tolerance for guns and gun shootings of our children. We could look at how, for a lot of times, child abuse results in something like a misdemeanor, whereas if you go and beat your dog, you can end up with a felony instead. So even child abuse is tolerated more than animal abuse still in this country. Okay, so our ideal culture says we love children. Our real culture speaks of something else. It speaks of something different, but not that. Okay. Sanctions are ways to authorize or formally disapprove of certain behaviors. So we can think of current cultural fights here in the United States, the one that is occurring over abortion. And that originally was sanctioned under Roe versus Wade, which gave women the right to their body and to making choices for themselves. And then that was recently overturned by our current justices, and now a lot of states are moving to make abortions illegal. Okay, and that's an example of the way we kind of try and sanction the way our culture should be moving. Okay, that's versus social control is a way to encourage conformity in cultural norms. So this isn't necessarily laws or legal aspects. This is the way people can get shamed if they're not standing in the line correctly, or they try to cut in line. It's what happens to individuals when they don't obey certain traffic laws and people start honking at them and calling them names. Or even on the good end of things, encouraging individuals to, for example, go to a religious ceremony or go to school or make that kind of, United States citizens are not required to go to higher education, but there is a lot of social pressure and social control that says you should. And so we have a lot of young people very confused about what they should do as far as higher education, which you guys explored before fall break. So these are just another layer of information we're adding to this complex thing we call culture. Come back to that. When we talk about norms, these are the visible and invisible rules of conduct through which societies are structured. Okay, informal norms are a cause of behavior that are generally and widely conformed to. Okay, and then we have formal norms. Those are established rules. Those are written rules that we have. So, for example, a informal norm is when you're a student and you go to class. The student usually sits in front of a desk, and a teacher usually either stands or is in front of the class, and we just go to those as just the norms that we have in our society. There's no formal rule that says a student sits at a desk and a teacher sits in front of a class. Those are not formal rules. It's something that we conform to. And then formal norms, probably a good example, again, going to the college, is if you noticed in the syllabus, there was a notice for Title IX, which states that sexual violence will not be tolerated on this campus, and there can be legal or consequences for doing that kind of action. Okay, so that's a formal norm that we've established to try and slow the tide of sexual assault that occurs in colleges. Okay. And while we consider culture norms as well as other behavioral norms as scientific terms within the discipline, most sociologists and cultural competency advocates indicate that we should resist the more associated with what is normal. Okay. In other words, we shouldn't refer to normal intelligence or normal relationships and so on. And what this is kind of saying that there's a propensity in a society to establish what is normal and what is abnormal. Okay, in the West, we do it using a disease model. So if you have certain symptoms and whatnot, we'll give you a label of depression or ADHD or anxiety, and the norm coming to being normal just means that you're acting appropriately in a given situation. Okay. And what this statement is referring to is that what we should be looking at when we're looking at culture is we should be looking at the diversity within that population and not establishing what is the prototype or what is the normal for a given situation. Okay. So let's talk about 4 types of cultures. Now, these are cultures that are within a broader culture, okay? And so the first term is what we call high culture. This refers to cultural patterns of this societal elite. So here in the United States, this would be the things that are a pattern for people like Bezos and the Tesla guy, and what is it kind of expected for them as far as representing that culture. Popular culture refers to the mainstream, widespread patterns among societies, populations. And the thing that I should say about popular culture is it's very much based on the technologies and the time you're in. So, if we look at popular culture in 1970s, rock and roll was more of a popular culture thing. And then in the 1980s, it went more towards mainstream type of music, okay? And then in the late 80s, it went to country music for a while. And so that's what we refer to as popular culture. And we see that the patterns of culture can change based on what has become known. I believe a term that is used in the world of social media is things that go viral are the things that kind of push popular culture in a certain direction. Okay? Subcultures are groups that share a specific identification apart from a society's majority, even as members exist within that larger society. And I think a really good example of this would be, for example, Native American groups, which has its own unique specific identification, but it still is part of this larger culture here in the United States. But we can also look at other subcultures. For example, rural farming cultures versus urban cultures. Those are two kind of subcultures, and there's different expectations for both, even though they both also follow other cultural norms. Okay. Countercultures are groups that reject or oppose societally widely accepted cultural patterns. So an example of this would be the hippie movement. You would even say some of the political movements of today. What happened on January 6th would be an example of a countercultural movement. And so this is just any group of individuals who are against the larger culture, and that's how they define themselves. I'm trying to decide. We should mention okay. So the last terms that I want to define for today's class is what's called globalization and or diffusion. Okay. Globalization refers to the integration of international trade and finance markets. And it's been a term that has been definitely used since probably the mid-1990s. And it refers to how goods and things are exchanged through trade and finance markets, and how that can influence or change a culture. Okay. Diffusion refers to the spread of material and non-material culture from one culture to another. So through globalization, we can see the diffusion of culture, because what kind of has started to occur is globalization has brought about a lot of normed behaviors, as you would say. And well, I think probably the best example is in Britain right now. A few years ago, they passed what's called Brexit. And what that basically is it takes them out of the UN Union financially. So now they have to use their own financial systems, their own currency to fund what's going on in Britain. Okay. Globalization brought about the UN Union, and really started making it so that you could travel anywhere in Europe, and the trade of money would be the same. That was kind of the idea behind it. So it would increase trade among those countries and give more buying power as a collective. Okay. But what happened is, in Britain, they found out that that actually was benefiting them in many ways, and now they're going through a lot of financial crises. And because they're becoming what's called nationalized, meaning only focus on the nation, they're going through a lot of recessions, almost to the level of the depression that we experience here in the United States. So that's kind of an example of what happens when globalization and then diffusion is kind of resisted once it's started its hold within a given culture. And I think that's all the terms. These are all things that I want to discuss. Okay. All right. So I want to stop here.